Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish and welcome back to English 122. It is week 4, so if you can believe it, we are nearly halfway through the semester, which is crazy, right? So like I said, this class goes by super fast. We're almost through the halfway point. I know it's 4th of July weekend. Everybody has lots of plans, I'm sure. So I want to go over what we're doing this week and to finish up our talk about the last couple of poetry chapters we have to finish up. So I've got myself kind of over here in the corner. I'm going to go to our weekly assignments page. And if you're not doing this already, make sure that you scroll down to the bottom of the page. I know this box here is very deceiving because it only shows 2 assignments, but make sure you're scrolling down to week 4 so that you can actually see all of the assignments and see what's due. So you'll notice here, as far as reading goes, there's not really any reading assignments this week since we're finishing up with poetry. Just watching this lecture video and making sure that you have the assignments completed on time. We have only 3 assignments this week, so it's a little bit less than usual. If you are wanting to revise paper 1, this is the last week to do so. I've already given you feedback on paper 1. If you decide you want to revise, it's completely optional, but you do have that right. You just need to email those revisions to me by Sunday the 5th. So as far as our assignments do, you can kind of see here, we have our discussion forum, which I will pull up and show you all for week 4. It's pretty much just based on the last couple of chapters that we're looking at, chapters 17 through 22. Obviously, we're looking at the glossy pages again, only this time it's after page 954. So I just want you to explain the poem image combination that you pick. What is the overall theme you see? What's the tone? Are they similar or different between the tone and of the image in the poem? And then why did you choose this? Is it like a typical poem or not? And just explain your answers. So it's just kind of rounding out our discussion and analysis of poetry for this discussion forum. So that is the discussion forum assignment. Your paper number 2 is due. Those of you that submitted a thesis and outline for your papers, I've given you feedback on those. They all look great. I really like the ones of you that chose to do the analysis of the songs or poems. Those look fantastic. Those of you that are doing your own, those ideas look great too. So far, everybody looks like they have a great topic, a good outline to present their papers in. If you have questions this week as you're constructing your paper, feel free to let me know, but also you are going to get a chance to revise this paper. So if you don't get a perfect grade on it, you will get a chance to go back and make revisions. But those drafts are due by Sunday the 5th as well. And then the final thing is our poetry exam. The poetry exam is exactly like our fiction exam. It is not timed. You do get to stop and save the exam if you want. And I believe in week 2's lecture video, I told you how to do that as well. So if you need to go back and see how to save an exam, go back to week 2's lecture video and I talk about it there. But for your poetry exam, it's very short, sweet, and it's due on Sunday as well. So the only thing due Friday is your discussion forum. Everything else is due Sunday. But like I said, most of you probably have plans for this weekend. So if you want to go ahead and get these done before 4th of July, I highly encourage it. I always grade early anyway, so if I can, so hopefully I can be able to get you your grades back to you before the weekend. So let's finish up our discussion of poetry. We're nearing the end of poetry, sadly. I hope that throughout the last 2 weeks you've gained a little bit more of an appreciation of poetry. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, and a lot of students say that this is actually the hardest paper in the class for them because they're not used to having to write poetry or to analyze it. So I understand that. But we're going to finish up with chapters 16 through 22. And most of the chapters here have very few terminology. So even though we're covering a lot of ground page-wise, if you've noticed in your textbook, most of the pages on poetry are just example poems, samples, examples to help give you an idea of how the terminology we discuss is put into practice. So chapter 16 talks about symbolism, and we've seen symbolism with prose. This is just it applied towards poetry. We have the terminology of allegory, which is just a set of symbols that work to get together to create a pattern. So places, colors, things that can have double meanings. We see that a lot in poetry. And the glossy pages, the second set on page 762, actually I really like this set because it shows an image, and that image is kind of a visual representation of the symbolism within the poems themselves. So if you get a chance, look at those glossy pages, just skim through them, pick one out, read the poem that's attached to it, and look at the glossy image. And hopefully that symbolism will be pretty apparent there. Chapter 17, again, we're moving right along. This is the web of language, and we've talked about texture with prose and how texture creates this kind of web of depth around the words that we read when we look at novels and books. And the same kind of holds true with poetry. Poetry creates a web. So if you're going to create a well-defined and constructed poem, you're going to be what we call a stickler, or very particular about using the right words exactly when you need to. So poets, they have a keen ear for the emotional quality of words. They don't just use commonplace words we see in novels or books a lot. They try to find very specific, perfect words to inflect the kind of meaning that they're wanting to have represented. And then we get into this discussion of connotation versus denotation, the emotional meaning versus the direct meaning, and which do we use within a poem. Also, we have to look at tone, which is the attitude that words create. What's the poet's tone that they're creating? And then I like to go over this word archaic language, because oftentimes, especially with older poems that are from the 1800s and on back, we're going to encounter words that we don't speak currently. One of the best and coolest things about language that really frustrates a lot of people is that language is constantly evolving. It changes. We synergize and synthesize words together. We drop words. We add new words. It's a completely evolving, developing system of communication. Whereas things like math and science are pretty rooted. The basics are rooted and they don't change. But language constantly is changing, especially within the last 20, 30 years, how many words we've added and developed. So it's archaic language is something that I feel we will encounter a lot, especially moving forward as we add on words into our vocabulary and we drop words. It's something that's pretty exciting. And they have a keen ear, poets do, for sounds of words. So there's a couple terminology terms here that I want to go over. This one is actually Dr. Rice on campus. He always said this was his favorite word, was onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia are just words that sound like they're spelled, and we have a lot of those. So buzz, stomp, slap, bam, like words that buzz, hiss, words that sound like they are spoken. That's onomatopoeia. And a lot of poets will utilize that to create not only a rhythm, but an effect in that poem as well. In poetic diction, this is kind of a more refined and elegant way of speaking. It's very formal, it's very flowery, it's very proper language in a poem, and it can be used to kind of create an atmosphere within the poem itself. And then finally we have circumlocution, and circumlocution is it's kind of its own definition. It's a phrase that takes the long way around a meaning. So circumlocution is just a flowery or elegant way of saying something very simple. So if you said that your primary residence, it's your home. I used to help students write resumes, and I had a student once that he said he was an Italian cuisine preparer. And I was like, and he says, I work at a pizza shop. And I always remember that, because I thought that's a really cool way of phrasing that on your resume to make yourself sound really cool when you're doing something that's just making pizzas. So that's circumlocution. Chapter 17 continued. We have dialects, which are ways that tell where the poet is from, or that helps create a setting for a poem. Because most poems will not have a setting. It's not like a book where they're like, and here's the farm where the story starts. It's like, no, the poem will just dive right in and will utilize language to kind of fill in the gaps for its readers. So a lot of times you can see on page 795, if you read this poem, I want you to read it out loud, because once you do, you may find yourself kind of creating your own Irish inflection, an Irish accent or Scottish accent, because of the way that certain vowels are formed in the words. And that's just to tell the reader, hey, here's where the poem is actually coming from. So it's a pretty cool way that authors and poets can kind of utilize language to create a setting. And then we have alliteration, which is probably my favorite term out of all of our lit terms we'll talk about this semester. Alliteration is repetition of the same sound at the beginning of several words in a line. So it's not rhyming, but it's very similar. And I love using alliteration when I create titles for papers because I think it's just a fun exercise and it's a fun way to use language. So on the speech team, we would do certain vocal exercises when I was on it in college, and they would be just alliterative phrases. So she sells seashells by the seashore. That's a line of alliteration. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's alliteration. The Human Torch was denied a bank loan. Not quite alliteration, but same vocal exercise. But the she sells seashores and Peter Piper, those are alliterative phrases that have a repetitive sound at the beginning of those words for a kind of poetic effect. All right, chapter 18, we have a lot of terms in this chapter. And so I've noted chapter 18 has a lot. It's just all very stylistic types of terminology. And you're not going to use all of these terms in your paper, so don't worry about that. I've had some students ask, like, do I have to use all of these terms? No, this textbook is just giving you a plethora of terminology so that when you analyze either the poems that you've selected or your own work, you have a lot that you can draw from to talk about in your paper. So chapter 18 is specifically focused on rhyme, meter, and stanza. So we have end rhyme and internal rhyme. End rhyme is what we're probably most used to with modern poetry, and that's rhyming at the end of the line in a verse. So we call that a normal rhyme scheme. Internal rhyme on page 818, 811 has an example of it, and it's rhyming within the lines of poetry rather than at the end of them. There is a review of meter and stanza on page 807 if you want to check it out. And then we have closed couplets. Closed couplets are 2 lines of self-containing rhymes. So in your book, you'll probably notice that some of the poems have a pattern to them. So like AA, BB, CC, or ABC, ABC. If you've got 2 that are self-containing rhymes like AA or BB, that's a closed couplet. It's just 2 lines that just happen to rhyme together. And then we have the final term here, multiple rhymes, which means that within the poem, more than 2 lines rhyme. And they give us 3 types of this: single, double, and triple. I'm going to ask you on our exam to give me an example of a single rhyme, a double rhyme, and a triple rhyme. And my examples here are pretty much all you have to do. Single rhyme is just 1 syllable of rhyming. Moon, soon. Double rhyme is when there's 2 syllables involved. So balloon, saloon. And the triple rhyme is probably the hardest, and that's when you have extrovert, introvert. So there's 3 syllables there. So as long as your examples on the exam kind of mirror this, you'll be fine. All right, other terminology we have for chapter 18, assonance. Assonance is similar to half and slant rhymes. It's just more of like an echo than an actual rhyme. So some examples that our book gives are break and fade. The break and fade kind of have a similar A sound, but it's not quite a half or slant rhyme. It's just barely there. And then you have like mice and fight. You have mice, fight. The I sound is similar enough to be assonance, but not quite a half or a slant rhyme. Some other terminology that our chapter gives us are anapest, which is when 2 unstressed syllables are in a foot. So we talked about iambic, where the latter syllable of a foot is stressed. In anapest, there's just no stressing. It just kind of just goes. And then we have trochaic versus iambic. Iambic, we talked about, is the 2nd syllable of a foot being stressed. Trochaic is the 1st syllable of a foot being stressed. I always think iambic is more natural, but I've seen poets use trochaic, and it's just a stylistic option, and it still works. And these other examples here are, again, continuing chapter 18. There's a lot, and I did not include all of the terminology in chapter 18. There is a ton. So if you want to go check out the ones that I've missed, definitely do so, especially for your paper. Dactyl is 2 unstressed syllables after a stressed one, so it's not quite a foot. There's 3 syllables involved. Blank verse. I've seen Shakespeare use a lot of blank verse. Unrhymed lines of poetry in a sonnet. So a sonnet is, like we talked about, 14 lines of poetry. Blank verse is when there's not really a pattern for the rhyme. So it's kind of like a form of open form poetry, blank verses, where there's a form, it's got a structure, but it doesn't have to necessarily rhyme. Pentameter is when you have 5 stressed syllables to a line of poetry. We're getting real specific, and you can look where pentameter is in our textbook. There is like hectometer, tetrameter. There's all these different types of meter usage where certain numbers of syllables are stressed. So there's a lot there to digest if you really want to get crazy with analyzing the poems and your own work. Villanelle is a country or folk song or poem. Most country music, bluegrass music, things like that originate as kind of storytelling. So villanelle is kind of the official term for that. And then we have 2 types of ballads. We have a popular ballad and a literary ballad. Now, popular ballad is something that's song-like. It's longer than a lyric. We talked about most songs being lyrics. They're short poems. So a popular ballad is song-like and a little bit longer, but not quite long enough to be like a extended poem or an epic. So Led Zeppelin's song Stairway to Heaven, that would be a popular ballad. Literary ballads are much more like stories. They're question and answer style lengthy poems. They tell a story and they almost ask the reader questions or give them answers to the questions that they ask. So if you've ever read The Hobbit or you've watched The Hobbit, there's a song in there called the Misty Mountain Song that the dwarves sing in it, and that would be a form of a literary ballad. It's much more story-like than just a song. All right, chapter 19, persona. We talked about persona in prose. This type of persona with poetry is just the voice speaking. So who is the voice? Not necessarily the narrator, but who is the voice in the poem? Some poetry is confessional, so it's highly personal, almost secretive. Page 853 has the Greek poet Sappho, who I absolutely love. Sappho's great. One of the only female poets recognized in ancient Greek times. You can see her poems there, and they are very like personal, almost like a journal entry that she wrote that we get to read. And then what the persona of a poem can do is it allows us to get a more intimate, personal feeling with what the poet is trying to convey. So it's very real, it's very grounded, it can be guarded, it can be detached, it can even be from an imaginary character that is very different from the poet. So I always think of Dr. Seuss when you read the Lorax. There are characters in there that are narrators or the personas of the poem that maybe aren't reflections of the authors themselves, but are trying to present us with a certain emotion or feeling that we should tie to. Chapter 20 talks about tone, which is they refer to as the language of emotions, and I like that terminology. Again, we've said it's the attitude that your poems create. So there's a couple of terms here with chapter 20. Understatement, we talked about with prose. It's very similar in poetry. You're just downplaying the emotions to create a stronger impact. So a great example of this is Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night on page 880. So I'd highly encourage you, take the time, read that poem. It's not long, but it examines complex emotions in a very understated, simplistic, poetic package. We have elegies, which are poems of mourning. So they're very much like if a eulogy is a speech for mourning, elegy is the poetic version of that. We have parables, which are brief stories that have very heavy meanings or purposes. And our textbook is in love with the parable of Icarus. There's like 6 different versions of it if you look in our textbook in chapter 20. If you don't know the story of Icarus, the story is that this inventor and his son, the inventor created a set of wax wings that he gave his son to use. The son was warned, don't fly too close to the sun or the wings will melt. But Icarus did not listen to his father's advice. He flew too close to the sun, his wings melted, and he fell into the ocean and drowned. So there's a moral there about heeding your elders' advice, about pride, about hubris, things like that. So our textbook goes into a great amount of detail breaking down the parable of Icarus. So if you want more insights and interpretations of it, you can look at chapter 20, and there's quite a few to go from. And again, our textbook really likes to define irony, and it can't decide at this point what exactly it wants to do as far as defining it. So this chapter's definition of irony is a wry, humorous effect that brings out a truth we prefer to hide. I'm not on board so much with that definition, but I wanted to include it just to show you that there's another way our textbook is trying to reconcile with that term. And then finally, we have paradox, which is a contradiction that they describe as making sense upon second thought. I'm not on board very much with that definition either. I think a paradox is something that keeps going back and forth and is cyclical. It can't escape itself, but that's how our textbook assigns a definition to that term. Chapter 21, the making of meaning. This chapter is fairly short in terms of terminology. The three things I want you to get from chapter 21, one is the idea of abstractions, where we've talked about abstractions like cliches, things like that in prose. Abstractions in poetry are kind of encompassing a large area of human experience. Didactic, on the other hand, is teaching accepted ideas or small t truths to an audience. So it's just teaching us a lesson through its poetry. It's not really, abstractions are like, here's this grandiose, big, broad topic we're going to talk about. Didactic is, here's a specific idea I want to tell you about. And then a caricature, if you've ever had a caricature done at a theme park or by a friend, it's just an extorted exaggeration or comic distortion. So when you get a caricature of yourself drawn, your face may look like exaggerated and bigger than your body and kind of out of proportion. That's kind of what a poem's caricature is. It's just exaggerating certain details for an effect. Chapter 22, our last chapter, is on myth and illusion. And they talk about a lot with myths and illusions in this last part. And I think it's interesting that they include it in the poetry section and not necessarily in prose. But I'm assuming that they believe we've read through the prose section by now. And so this kind of just ties into both. Myth comes from the Greek word mythos, or tales. Poetry that is a myth is basically about gods or goddesses or heroes that are godlike, so think Hercules, and then their monstrous adversaries. These types of poems often had rituals that the hero or the protagonist had to do, or they had to go on a quest to redeem themselves, or something of that nature. And then we get the discussion of archetypes, which happen quite a lot in prose, and we will see happen even more so when we get to drama and things like that. And an archetype is basically just a generalized or stereotyped type of person. So you think of, what's the stereotypical hero like? Or better yet, what's the stereotypical damsel in distress? How is that character portrayed in fiction or in literature or poetry? And then like your villain. So I feel like with modern day writing, we subvert a lot of these archetypes. Like your damsel in distress, normally it's stereotypically referred to as like a weak-willed woman or a princess trapped in a castle. And a modern interpretation of that might be like, oh, it's a dude. It's a guy stuck in a tower instead. So that would be a subversion of that archetype. But we see a lot of them in poetry. And going on to finish out our review here, we have these terms here with myth and illusion. Illusion itself is not illusion, it's allusion. And an allusion is a callback. So it's something that usually leads to a flashback. So if you've ever seen a flashback of something, or if you've ever heard someone say, well, this alludes to that, what allude means is it leads you to think back on it. So oftentimes poetry will allude to something else, like it will mention a line and that will make you think of something else. That's an allusion. An ode is similar to an elegy. It's not necessarily about mourning though. It's just something about a more somber or solemn subject. It's not a funny poem. It's something that's traditionally viewed as serious and like a tribute sort of thing. Metamorphosis is a transformation. It's a pretty common term. And then for our discussion forum, you have your glossy pages on page 954, the last set of glossy pages in our book. And again, chapter 22, much like chapter 20, is all about that Icarus. There are a lot of poems and examples about the tale of Icarus that's been reinterpreted. It's similar to Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast or Alice in Wonderland, those kind of timeless stories that we've retold over and over again, Little Red Riding Hood, all of those things. Icarus is kind of one of those. And there's lots of modern day examples of people applying the myth of Icarus to that. So yeah, that is the end of our poetry unit. Again, I hope that you've really enjoyed it. I hope you have a better appreciation for poetry. I'm really excited based on what you all have said you're going to do for paper two to see your drafts and see what all you do. I'm extremely excited and I know that you guys are going to do awesome. So, as always, if you have any questions this week, please feel free to email me, contact me, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you all have a very, very safe 4th of July weekend and that you really enjoy it. And I'll come back next week and we will get started. We'll be past the halfway point, starting to talk about drama with paper five or with week 5 and paper number 3. So have a great week, guys, and I'll talk to you all again soon. Bye.